Hello, ecologists. Miss Ray here. We'll be kicking off this unit of ecology by relying on our past knowledge of organization of life from Unit 1, Lesson 2. So we categorize organisms by how they get their energy and see how energy flows through the ecosystems via the biotic factors. We will also learn how matter such as carbon, water, and nitrogen are used and recycled over and over in the environment and how biotic factors help with some of these processes. Let's get started. Ecosystems, Unit 2, Lesson 1 notes. Please note when we have a pencil on the screen, you're supposed to be writing what's on the screen. There are going to be several slides on this video presentation where you will not have to write anything down, either because the extra information is background, or in some cases, we'll be providing better images later on with your other activities. So let's go on and start by defining our term that actually is the name of this unit, ecology. So ecology, let's break the word down. Ology means to study. Eco is shortened for ecosystem. So it's the study of ecosystems. And we know that ecosystems is an area that has both it's the biotic and the abiotic in that area. So we're going to be talking about how organisms interact with other organisms. So living things interacting with living things, but also how living things interact with non-living things, those abiotic factors, because that's really important too. And as we said before, we can't talk about an ecosystem without talking about biotic and abiotic. Remember though that biotic is not just living, it can sometimes be used to live. In other words, things that are dead, like a rotting log or the food that we eat. We also can't ignore abiotic factors in an environment. They play a very important role. And specifically in this lesson, we'll be talking about how energy flows through an environment. And we cannot talk about energy flowing through without recognizing that there are some resources that are abiotic factors that are very important to this process, like sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. So to start that, we're going to be focusing on the level of organism and classifying different types of organisms in an ecosystem. And we need to understand this, that all living things do need energy and utilize energy to run their cells. But how they get that energy and how is different depending on what type. And we can organize these organisms into two different types based off of how they get their energy. And then there's some subtypes below that too. The first type is an autotroph. Let's break that word down. Auto means self, troph means energy. So it can be defined as an organism that is able to get energy by itself. It doesn't need another living thing to help it. It can do it itself. And it's going to get that energy from sunlight or through chemicals. And we also can call this a primary producer. It's also known just as a producer. We use these terms interchangeably, but autotroph is definitely our better and more scientific word. And an autotroph is able to, once it in the process of capturing the sunlight or chemical energy that it's harvesting, it's going to end up creating these carbon-rich molecules, which we call, for example, glucose, in the process of either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. And that's going to be how energy actually enters an environment or an ecosystem. That's why autotrophs are so very important. All life depends on these producers because, again, they're the ones that get that sunlight, the energy that's in the sun, that consumers cannot get and have no access to, and puts it in a location within themselves to then later be consumed by consumers and get the energy into the ecosystem. So it's very, very important. Now, we mentioned photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Both of them are creating and capturing energy to then be put into the ecosystem. The main difference is whether sunlight is present or not. Most autotrophs are going to be utilizing photosynthesis. In other words, they harvest the sunlight and change it into carbohydrate-rich molecules like glucose. But sometimes there's places where you have ecosystems that do not have sunlight. They lack it, it's too dark. A lot of times these are in caves or maybe deep in the ocean. And these organisms that are able to, again, that are autotrophs, instead of using sunlight, they use chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide to then, again, create those carbohydrates that can be consumed by other organisms and create food chains and food webs from. Our second type is a heterotroph, also known as a consumer. So let's break down the word heterotroph. Hetero means different, troph means energy. So we can define this as an organism that uses other organisms to get its energy. And it relies on these other organisms. Remember, heterotrophic consumers can't get energy directly from the sun. They can't just walk out there and go, give me energy. They have to eat it. And there are some subtypes of heterotrophs. We have herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, and decomposers. Now, when we're looking at these prefixes, suffixes, and root terms, you might notice vor is repetitive. Vor means to eat. And what the prefix at the very beginning of the word is, it's what they're eating. So herbivores, they are plant eaters. Omnivores, omni means all, so they can eat both animals and plants. And carnivore means meat, so they're meat eaters. Decomposers are a little bit different than the other three. What they're doing is that they take dead organisms, whether those are plants or animals, and they break them further down into nutrients that goes into the soil. These organisms are extremely important to our ecosystem because so many organisms, like our plants, our producers, rely on healthy and nutrient-rich soil that has things like nitrogen in them. So decomposers play a role with that. And they also are getting energy just by, again, breaking down the organic matter. And we can find them pretty much at any point in time when an organism dies, we can find a decomposer. Now, here are some images that go with these descriptions of consumers. We have a carnivore, like this otter, again, solely a meat eater. An herbivore, a plant eater, like this bird, and the macaw. And then we have an omnivore, which is, again, like this badger that can eat plants, but also and berries and seeds, but also can turn around and eat fish and other small rodents and things like that too. We really want to mainly focus on decomposers, but there's two other terms that sometimes get thrown around when we're talking about energy flow. One is detrivore. So detrivores are a type of consumer that specifically lives in soil and is continuing to sort of break down that soil. We sometimes consider them a type of decomposer, but not microscopic. Worms are a great example of this. We also have scavengers. Scavengers are really just a type of carnivore, except for they're later on in a food chain or food web, not because they're an apex predator, but in actuality, they're just going to be eating things that they find dead already. They're not hunting it down. There's no prey-predator relationship going on. Instead, they're the things that find roadkill and they're like, ooh, that's a snack. I'm going to eat that. Or, oh, this lion didn't finish off eating this zebra, so I'm going to finish it off. Hyenas are a great example of a type of scavenger. They don't always do the hunting themselves and sometimes rely for other things to do the killing, and then they come back and sort of help clean it up and get their food that way. Now, energy does flow through this ecosystem. And one of the ways that we represent this is a food chain. And this is going to be including a series of organisms where we see how energy is transferred from one organism to another. The main things that we need to know about a food chain is it only is going to show one energy flow option. It's just one option. For example, in this, grass is eaten by the grasshopper, so the energy goes into the grasshopper. We can see that arrow going through. The grasshopper is eaten by the frog. The energy goes into the frog. The frog is eaten by the snake. The energy goes into the snake. The snake is eaten by the eagle. The energy goes into the eagle. But our big takeaway is that frogs eat other things than grasshoppers, and grasshoppers might eat other things than grass. Maybe they're eating leaves off of a bush or something else. This only shows one option in an ecosystem. One other thing that we know about food chains is it always has to start with an autotroph. You have to get the energy somewhere. Remember that these are the only types of organisms that can bring that energy into the ecosystem from the sun or in chemicals in the case of chemosynthesis. Oh, and before we move on, I do suggest you do not have to draw out these organisms, but I would suggest jotting down grass and putting an arrow, and grasshopper putting an arrow, and a frog and an arrow, and a snake and an arrow, and an eagle and an arrow if you have not done so already. A food web is a network of feeding interactions through which both energy and matter move. This is sort of the next step of a food chain. A food web actually shows multiple food chains, but in an area. And again, unlike food chain, which shows only a single option or one option, food webs show multiple energy flow options. And we can actually look here and find several different food chain options to isolate if we so choose. I would suggest that just like how you wrote down what organism it was and showed arrows, that you might do this in your notes too. So start off with maybe grass and then have an arrow, and you have snail, you have a rabbit, you have a caterpillar, you have a lizard, you have a small bird, and you have a bald eagle. So you can write those down. You don't have to draw the organisms themselves. These are just more examples of more complex food webs. And even the crazy thing is that these still aren't as detailed as they could be. We rarely are ever going to see a food web that has every single organism with all of their feeding options represented. It just would be so complicated, too many arrows, too complicated to utilize. But notice how this is much more complex than a very simple food chain. Now, something else we need to know is that as things are consuming and eating further and further and further down a food chain, there's the energy that's being passed along. A primary producer is going to be able to bank 100% of the energy from the sun that it's able to carry, which is great. But it needs to use some of that energy to run its bodily functions, its organs, its tissues. And also it's going to be giving off a lot of energy in the form of heat. And what happens before the consumer, or when the consumer actually eats a plant or a producer, it's actually going to only bank 10% of that 100% of energy. 90% is lost and does not go into the consumer that ate the plant, the herbivore. And so forth, as we go forward, only 10% actually gets passed along. 90% is lost in the form of heat. Now, this is just another picture of this trophic level pyramid. We have our base. You'll notice that in this pyramid, the base is very, very important. This is where all of our autotrophs are. If we looked at all of the organisms in the whole entire planet, we would need to have more autotrophs than any other type of organism, because we need them to form the basis of energy flow into all of the different ecosystems on this planet. As we move up, we have additional trophic levels, such as the primary consumers, the first consumer in that food chain. And then you have the second consumer in the food chain and the third consumer in the food chain. And remember that as we move up, the energy that's passed along gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, we've been talking about how energy flows through an ecosystem, but there are other important resources needed that move differently in this global system. So we know that energy flows. In this picture, we have this sort of water wheel, and energy is flowing like water over the top of it and just moving onward. But the water wheel is like the cycles of matter. There's several different matter that we're going to be talking about. And remember, matter cannot be created nor destroyed, but it can be recycled. And we're going to remember cycle, recycled. So matter again is recycled, energy flows, just like we say energy flow. Now, let's talk about these cycles of matter. Matter can change form. In other words, we can see it. It can go from a gas form. It can be broken down into different compounds. We can find solids, liquids. We can see physical and chemical changes that are occurring. But it's not going to disappear. We can still see and we can find where those atoms go. So we can see it being used and then reused in various cycles. And this is going to help us understand our biosphere, the whole entire planet. They have all of these different cycles that we're going to be learning about, and also all these different processes that work within the cycles to help things be used and changed through them. And our biosphere is sort of broken up into all these different sort of subgroups: biosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere. So the biosphere is the parts where we have interactions with living things. The atmosphere, this is the gases that are above the land. We have the geosphere, which is the land, and the hydrosphere, which is the water. And when we're talking about all of those, we also have all these processes that happen within these cycles, like the biological processes, the geological processes, the physical and chemical processes, and the human activities. And we're going to define these on this next slide. So as we said before, there are these processes: biological, bio meaning life. So these are activities and processes that are performed by living things. If in the description a living thing is mentioned, or a process is done by a living thing, it is a biological process. Let's talk about geological process. Geo meaning land. So this is a process that is involving land or rock, typically on or below the Earth's surface. We also have physical and chemical processes. This is where we have physical changes, like water, for example. Can be evaporated and turned into water vapor, or it can freeze and become, again, a solid. So we have these physical changes of matter, but we also have chemical changes that also occur. And then we have human activities. Human activities, again, any processes that involve specifically humans. We could say human activities are sort of like a subset of the biological processes, but how we're going to define them both: if a human is involved, human activities; if it's a living thing besides a human, biological processes. So we're going to, again, be working with these terms. We're going to be playing a lot of review games and activities to help us reinforce our knowledge and be able to sort what we know. Congratulations, you've completed your notes. So we said before, we'll be adding images and other kind of things to help make them better. Great job, and have a great day.